My name is Susan Miller Havens. This is the Somerville Museum, and I want to talk about this exhibit, which is called Green Fields of the Mind. There are two things that I'd like to do today. One is to talk about the kinds of things that have contributed to my way of seeing in painting, and also to say something about the artists who have influenced my work. First of all, I want to make a broader statement, and that is that I really believe that painting is an emotional response that an artist has to his experience of life and also to the way he or she sees life. In terms of seeing, I've tried to think about what kinds of things I could look back on that contributed to my way of seeing. One of the most important and enduring ways, I think, is the way in which my mother taught me to see. And she did that by means of helping me with crafts at a very early age and being a craftsperson herself. She was surrounded by museum people. We spent hours on end in museums together, looking, and she would always be saying to me, "Do you see that? Do you see this? Can you make it smaller? Can you make it bigger?" We worked on projects together. We sewed, beginning, I think, at about the age of 4, when I learned how to roll handkerchiefs and try to go around the border left-handed while she went around the border right-handed. And then we spent a lot of time with her friends in museums in New York. One of my greatest saving moments was when I learned that I was old enough to go on the bus from New Jersey to New York to the Museum of Fine Art, where the water lily room existed, and Monet's paintings were throughout the museum, but in this particular place there were 3 walls that were paneled with water lilies. And as a teenager, that was my place of peace. I'd forgotten about that until recently, when I tried to reconstruct the kinds of influences on my painting. And I remembered that actually Monet and his way of seeing the elements in the world are indelled in my mind forever. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the fact that my mother and I always had things going at the same time. If I was messing around with paints, she was always doing something. And one of the examples I have here is something that she did when she was in her 70s, felt that it was important for a person to be free to experiment. And I once told her that I thought I'd like to make a hat, and she suggested that I go off with my pennies and my allowance and go to the button store and buy a hat form. And I bought a hat form and some absolutely divine velour stretchy stuff and a very sparkly pin and a feather, and I stretched the stuff over this hat form and made a very funny looking hat, which I don't believe she ever wore, although I know that she loved it, and she always made me feel as though it was a good idea to experiment. When it came time for me to go to school, I found that I really did not want to, or have the confidence probably, to become an artist, and I saw that a number of my mother's friends who were artists had quite a bit of a struggle to keep themselves afloat. So I chose to go to nursing school, and later on I went into surgical nursing because I was still very interested in the way in which the body worked and the way that people look, the way that people think. In those days, it was not a great idea for a girl to go into medicine, to become a physician. You were encouraged to go into nursing. In terms of seeing, which is what I've been trying to focus on here, when we are in training for nursing, the biggest push really on a daily basis is learning how to see. And what they mean about learning how to see is to observe what is going on physically in a patient's body. So for 8 hours a day, you were looking at skin and nail beds and ears and eyes, looking to see what was changing, what the inside of the body was, what was going on. The other way that they taught us observation, of course, was through surgery and also through learning how to bandage broken limbs, and also through another point of view, and that was from the inside out. And the inside out meant going to the autopsy room and seeing what really was what was the part of the body that was diseased that was making that outside of the body yellow. And that was a fascinating experience, which I've never forgotten. In psychiatry, which was something that was a rotation in nursing school, and I would later go into as a profession and later become a psychologist, they were asking us to listen. I found that I was still seeing, and so a person who might be frightened or paranoid, I would tend to listen, but find myself actually making my observations by seeing. So I would see the fear in a person's eye, I'd see the trembling in their hands before I would hear what they said. Later on, I decided that what I really missed terribly was painting. And I had an opportunity in my career to go back to school while I continued to work in a clinic in Boston. And I went to Wellesley, where I was a studio and art history major. There at Wellesley, they had a wonderful idea, and that was that if you were going to take art history, then you also had to learn how to do it. And the way that they taught us to see at that particular time was to say that they wanted us to work in exactly the same way that the Renaissance artists had worked. So that meant that we went into the studio and we learned how to do egg oil emulsion, which meant taking the skin off an egg yolk. And believe it or not, there were cartons of eggs that were used in that particular exercise because you have to take the skin off with a pinhead. And a number of students were unable to do that and didn't go very far in that first class. But at any rate, we mixed egg, this wonderful egg yolk, and oil and pigment from the good earth, just dry pigment. And then we were instructed to choose probably a master, a Renaissance master, to copy. And this was based on the old way of teaching, and some people still teach this way, that in order to be an artist, you had to be able to copy pieces that were in the Louvre. And the saying Courbet said, if you haven't been to the Louvre, you have no right to abstract. So we were sent to the Louvre, essentially. And this little painting is a detail of a Botticelli. It's a Venus. And the detail, of course, the detail work in this was very constraining. And this is on board. Often they didn't use canvas. The next part of that class was to move into a 20th century. The light comes from the top of the paint rather than from underneath it. So we had a tremendous feeling of freedom. So that was a wonderful help in refining my way of seeing and doing.